like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge this same way Kathy did, that we really learn and learn so much from Indigenous thought leaders in this area. I'd also like to just acknowledge anyone who intentionally uses their lived experience within their research. And yes, it's as I'll talk about, it's not always an easy thing to do, but there are rewards as well. So, not the best with technology either. There we go. I'm going to race through the first parts of my presentation just to ensure we've got time for discussion. And I think some of the latter part of my presentation is probably the most interesting and thought-provoking part. But we will make these slides available online and the video recording as well, so you can come back to anything. So just to give you a bit of context, I'm at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. We've been running since 2012, and our role really is to support interdisciplinary and community engaged research across social equity issues. So although we're in the law school, we work on behalf of the whole university. We are also part of a small family of other interdisciplinary research institutes, including biodiversity, disability, we do a lot of work with them, and energy. And just a little bit about me. So yes, I have a bit of a weird academic kind of background, but I'm a migrant woman my parents are from Asia, and we lived in the UK. So I've got a migrant experience. I'm a cis woman of colour, and I'm able-bodied. I use she, her pronouns, and I really see myself as an engagement practitioner. So all of my whole career has been working at the intersection of academia and the outside world. I started off in industry engagement and sort of quickly moved on to working with cultural institutions and not-for-profits, in community. And as I said, I self-identify as a nerd. So although I come from a practice background, I really kind of get excited about the academic literature in this area. I undertook a Master of Public Health way back. No, it took me forever to finish it because I was doing it part-time, but the research I'm presenting today is from my research capstone, which Kathy was one of my supervisors for, and also Karen Block, our deputy director, who's not, where is she? She's somewhere amazing in the world. She's just been horse riding in Albania, and sending us pictures, making us very jealous. And this research is really embedded within the work that I do at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. So we've really tried to create an enabling environment for participatory researchers at the university, and to sort of challenge systems and processes that don't support that or create barriers. So I'm just going to go through a bit of background before I get into the meat of the presentation. So as you will all know, participatory research, lived experience involvement in research is on the rise. And generally, I think that's a really good thing. But I think we need to really remember that this came out of really radical organising by people with lived experiences of themselves. So it's not something that universities thought up. It's not something that governments thought up. This is something that was advocated for from grassroots kind of organising. The nothing about us without us kind of saying really grew out of the disability movement in South Africa in the 60s, and I think that has been adopted by other kind of civil society movements. And that kind of participatory turn, I think, as it's called, really emerged around that time, 60s, 70s, and has, like present day, has become something that we're all trying to think about. How do we do this well? How do we involve lived experience in research? So, but there's a lot of researchers talking about the ubiquitous nature of of this type of movement, or this approach to research, policy making and service delivery. And we all hear the co-word peppered in everything: co-design, co-production, co-creation. So I think we just really need to remember the radical roots of this movement. From a research perspective, this kind of sits under a sort of participatory research umbrella, which is, a values-based philosophical kind of approach to research. Again, it came through grassroots organising to reject the stigmatising impacts of some research, and is heavily influenced by the work of Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian educational theorist. The whole kind of ethos of this is doing research with, for, and by people with lived experience, not on or to them, so they're not subjects of our research. And it really has a very explicit social justice agenda. You'll have to forgive me, I'm feeling very brain foggy today, and it's, I think, something that happens to women of a certain age. So yes, if I lose my train of thought, you'll know why. So my research really was interested in lived experience researchers, and they do go by other names. So they might be called peer researchers in some contexts, co-researchers, consumer researchers. There's a whole host of other names, but really it's those who are employed or engaged in research because of their lived experience. They may or may not have kind of more formalized research training, but they're usually lay people recruited for their lived experience. And this is a method that's very much rooted in participatory research practices. Am I pointing at the right? Oh, right. That's why it's not working. Thank you. Okay, so there's a lot that's been written about the promises and the pitfalls of working with lived experience researchers. As you can imagine, the benefits are around enhanced relevance and greater access to population groups, increased sort of richness of the data collected and more nuanced insights, and enhanced validity and potential impact as well. There are critics of this way of working. So there may be methodological limitations of working with people with lived experience, particularly if they are not able to work past their lived experience. So there's some literature around sort of the difference between lived experience and lived expertise, and a potential lack of rigour. But all of these can be accounted for or mitigated against. And the challenges, there are certainly ethical challenges of working in this way that researchers need to be cognizant of. Exploitative practices, and we'll get to some of that in the research findings, and the risk of re-traumatization. And this research can be time-consuming and emotionally laborious for everyone involved. That makes it sound really negative, but it's also, the flip side of that is that it can be emotionally very rewarding and very, although time-consuming, can be really rich in, you know, future relationships and the depth of kind of understanding between people. So, and in the research gap, so there has been quite a lot written about this, but it's all from the perspective of the benefits and challenges experienced by academics rather than lived experience researchers themselves. And not as much has been written about the long-term kind of or sustained impacts of researching in this way, particularly for those who are engaged as lived experience researchers. So lived experience researchers work within an ecosystem, so a research ecosystem, as a lot of academic and other colleagues here do. And the different levels of this ecosystem can impact and influence the experience of lived experience researchers across kind of different levels. So my research questions, so what are the motivations, expectations and aspirations of former or current University of Melbourne lived experience researchers, and how might these be met? And what are the institutional supports that are required to embed ethical, empowering and equitable lived experience research practices at the University of Melbourne? And for this, I used a feminist moral theory called a feminist ethic of care. It sort of decenters sort of male-centric philosophies and values relationality, interdependence, compassion, responsibility, competence, responsiveness, trust and reciprocity. And I really like this quote from Gilligan. The ethic of care guides us in acting carefully and highlights the cost of carelessness, of not paying attention, not listening, being absent rather than present, not responding with integrity and respect. And in this work, I argue that we need both an interpersonal, but importantly, an institutional ethic of care. So looking to our systems and processes and what the university itself values. So For this study, I used qualitative research methods, and the inclusion criteria was former or current lived experience researchers at the university. I interviewed 16 people in total, and used and everyone, you'll see quotes soon, but they're all pseudonyms to protect anonymity given the very small sample size. Okay, so these are the participant demographics. It's quite a good, I thought it was quite a good spread, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the high number of people who identified as female in the sample. The type of lived experience, well, participatory research, I have noticed or found, does seem to have a kind of a gender bias. Like, so there does tend to be women or gender diverse people, majority women and gender diverse people that are attracted to this way of working. I also find anything kind of in the social equity area, there's, again, the gender balance is usually quite off there. And also I wanted to also point out the kind of high educational kind of levels of this sample as well, which perhaps shows that lived experience research is not always representative of those who are experiencing the most marginalisation. And even from this sample, one undertook a master's degree as a result of her participation in a really terrific research project, and two went on to PhD study as well. So the people in the sample tended to be people who were interested in research, and research, kind of professional research as well. And in terms of the types of lived experience that people brought, so I'm not going to read all of these out, but it was a good spread of different and diverse lived experiences. So people with disabilities, mental health issues. There were younger people and people from migrant refugee backgrounds, and also victim survivors of family violence. So I'm doing pretty well for time, yeah. So my research came out with, my analysis came out with 6 key findings, and I will probably race through the first 3 because these probably have the least surprises, and spend a bit more time on the latter 3. Okay, so it won't surprise you to learn that people with lived experiences who are involved in research do it because they want to make change, social change. They want to challenge the injustices they may have experienced. They tend to be sort of systemic injustices. They want to improve systems and conditions. Oh, sorry. Thank you for letting me know. There we go. Thank you. They really want to make change for future generations, so they don't have to experience the level of sort of inequities or injustices that they experience. They quite often feel a responsibility to give voice to their communities that perhaps they feel is underrepresented in research or maybe misrepresented in research. And a number of them were motivated to gain new skills. So there was one community researcher who said, well, I really wanted to understand more about qualitative research methods because they came from a science background, but really just didn't want to do a PhD or further study. So this was a really good way for them to get a feel for qualitative research. And as Rachel said, being involved is my way of contributing and trying to make use of my experience. What has it all been for, if not? You have to try to turn the negative into a positive. Right, so the next finding was that lived experience research can be both rewarding and very taxing. So for some, they spoke about sort of profound and life-changing experiences that were very formative to their futures and the work that they're doing now. Some really spoke of the work really validating their experiences and sparking joy when they're connecting with other people with similar lived experiences. And a real sense of satisfaction in doing good work and good and valuable work. So Alison said that they gained a love of writing that I'd never had before. My love of learning increased significantly. I wouldn't have applied for the master's had I not done that project. It's been pretty darn significant for me. Others talked about sort of post-traumatic growth and the therapeutic benefit of doing this kind of work. So Cameron said it was fundamental to keeping him well. And Nat talked about there is a therapeutic benefit along the lines of post-traumatic growth. It almost helps you to process it by talking through it. You relive it, but in a safe space. And these findings suggest that academics have a duty of care to support lived experience researchers to navigate the complexities of their positionality and community responsibilities, and to ensure that participating in research does not entail an undue emotional and mental burden for those lived experience researchers. There was also, on a more negative side, there was the risk of, and this has been picked up in the literature, but the risk of re-traumatization. So even within teams that had really good had a really good ethic of care towards each other, things could still be challenging or triggering for some people. So having experienced similar experiences of abuse or neglect, leaving an interview and trying to bring yourself back to everything okay is not easy. And that was Helena who said that, who was a very experienced lived experience researcher and had many years of experience on different projects. And some talked about the burden of responsibility, particularly when things went sideways in projects, or when academics were really rushing to get to an outcome and not taking the time required to really understand the issues, but also, so Jess said, I've already felt myself burning out. You don't have the capacity to be able to speak up, so you don't say anything, and that does take a toll. You know it's going to affect your community. I feel powerless and guilty as well. Guilty for the fact that I can't speak up, but I know I don't have the power to. And this talks a lot to issues around power and power differentials and dynamics within research teams, and I'll touch on that a bit later. So in terms of trust, it needed to be earned both between sort of the professional academics and the lived experience researchers, but also within the team, the broader team itself. Trust needs to be nurtured, and it also needed to be reciprocated as well, particularly between the professional researchers and towards the lived experience researchers. So, so academics in embodying an ethic of care need to, and Felicity mentioned this, move at the speed of trust. And that's in terms of relationships and dynamics across the whole research team. And to create safe spaces to build skills and confidence. So Angelica talked about always feeling okay if she made a mistake. So they skilled us up. It was always okay to potentially stuff up or not do it perfectly, because she was, working with people in a safe space who were all learning together. So academics need to demonstrate their trust in the lived experience researchers and provide opportunities for them to shine. I think, learning what people's skills are, what their aspirations are in wanting to do this work, what they want to get out of it, and creating those opportunities for those people to, maybe it's present work or facilitate a group, or, do in a sort of structured way if they're doing interviews, to support them through that interviewing process until they've built the skills and confidence to do it themselves. Talking about reciprocity, Cameron talked about how it was really important that even though the academics didn't have exactly the same lived experience as them, that they were still open and sharing. So that thing about reciprocity. And he said to be vulnerable with each other was a really important thing. So, so responsible leadership. So we talked a little bit about power, but something that really surprised me, because participatory research quite often is really aiming for equal power sharing between people with lived experience and researchers, and a number of them said, actually, no, that doesn't sit right with me. The academics, it's their name on the ethics application. They have to report back to the funders. The responsibility isn't shared equally, so power can't be shared equally. But what they said they really needed from academics was for them to listen to them, to consider what their contributions are, but then also to be responsible leaders. So I think this is probably a really key point, that power sharing is in an ideal world, that's wonderful, but actually responsible leadership is more critical to making these types of research projects, as well as the experience of lived experience research, is a positive one. They talked a lot about the personal characteristics of the people that they'd worked with, the researchers they'd worked with. So they talked about them being curious and open-minded, that they were a people person. Sorry, that's not rolling off the tongue. That they lacked ego, that it was about the work, not their work. It's about their collective work. They were skilled in participatory research, and I think this is a really, really important point. That, and again, some of the later findings will discuss this more, but I don't think you can divorce the practice of working with lived experience from the philosophical underpinnings of it. So, that participatory research is a methodology that requires skills in how to manage participatory research projects. And one researcher, lived experience researcher, said that you could tell that the team had those skills, and because of the lack of ego, they weren't having to. The lived experience researchers weren't having to kind of observe or witness kind of conflict within the professional academic research team. And responsible leadership requires that the benefits of research is shared equitably across the team. There was criticism of researchers who are building their careers off the back of people's lived experience, but then the lived experience researchers, they've got a couple of, casual contracts on their CV to show for it. That responsible leadership requires creating a culture of care and safety, not just for the lived experience researchers, because some of them said, actually, I don't want to be treated differently to the rest of the team. I want the whole team to be treated well. And to appreciate the complexities of lived experience researchers' lives, that, they've been employed for their lived experience, or they're engaged for their lived experience. And that this might present itself, like the situations that have caused maybe trauma or challenges in their life might still be present. So Hannah said, in the case of my family, in my experience, there's no lived, it's always living. I think this isn't in the research or the paper, but I've been having discussions with people recently who are talking about, well, we're expected to be professional, like it's the professionalization of lived experience, but then we're also expected to be vulnerable at the same time. So, there's a real tension there. Ooh, sorry. So building on that, so lived experience research is not a fashion. So quite a few people were really quite forceful in saying this, that people talked about it being flavour of the month, and just as something's flavour of the month this month, it might not be next month, but I think all the people here really care about this kind of work being enduring and developing systems that support it into the future. So I think there's a real risk if we do it badly now that it will not be flavour of the month next month. Some talked about it being misused, and that their contributions felt tokenistic. And some talked about feeling like they were only there to tick a box to say lived experience is involved, give us the grant. And they talked about the awful kind of feelings of that, like that generates for them. Like they're there, like the first finding, I talked about them wanting to make a difference. And so they get involved in a project because they want to make a difference, because they've had these experiences in their lives, but then their research, their insights are not being like taken into account. And that is harmful and disempowering. They talked about academics sometimes looking for shortcuts. Maybe that means going back to the usual suspects. Maybe that means not including people in the research project that should be there because it's kind of easier to get the person that they worked with last time, even though they might not have that lived experience. And mainly they talked about poor implementation. And we're actually very empathetic towards academics that perhaps they'd not had the best experience with. So they understood that they were time poor, that, there's a lot of pressures on them as well, to meet deadlines, to deliver on grants. But others talked about a lack of ideological commitment to participatory research and kind of epistemic incompatibility. So, there were teams doing this kind of work or trying to do it, trying to engage lived experience, but not doing it well because they just didn't have the training. They hadn't had exposure to participatory research projects or methodologies. They didn't have anyone on their team that had that experience. So Shamila said, actually, this one's probably even worse because they would talk they said, wow, they're talking about participatory research, but not actually doing it. So they dressed up this research project as a participatory research project. They say they're committed to it, but actually not doing it. And I think Shamila was really quite disappointed in that experience. And the final finding was that an institutional ethic of care is critical. So for both universities and universities as systems and structures and institutions, as well as for lived experience researchers, the cost of carelessness is that we harm people intentionally or unintentionally. So as I said before, lived experience researchers recognise that academics are battling systems that were not always well suited to participatory research. And I'd like to do another study with academics who do this kind of work because I think in terms of, there's a lot of people that have just worked against systems or despite systems or worked around systems to do this work well. And I think it's time we stop doing that and change the systems. So, and there's suggestion that the University of Melbourne, so my research, this project is very localised, and so are the findings, needs to provide more centralised supports for both university-based and lived experience researchers. So that's training, professional development and accreditation, a community of practice, and lived experience supervision came up a little bit as well. So, I understand that this is a pretty common social work practice, that social workers have supervision that's sort of external to their own teams, where they can debrief and talk about their own professional practice. So I think lived experience supervision came up quite a lot. And I do know of really good examples of projects that have got, say, large grant funding from external funders, and they have, as a budget line item, outsourced that lived experience supervision to organisations like Beyond Sticky Notes, awesome organisations. So, where this is really valid, if you're going to include lived experience, you need to ensure that they're fully supported, and that may include lived experience supervision externally or internally. And Steph said, if the university wants happy co-researchers, then it needs to think about a happy workplace for everybody. So, for academic colleagues in the room, we see you. We know it's really, really hard. The university doesn't make it easy. So this is, I guess, where the title of my presentation comes from. So these are sort of, I would say that the majority of people I spoke to had really positive experiences, but there were some really stark kind of examples, I guess, of people that had been horribly treated and exploited, or people that had varying sort of degrees varying experiences across multiple projects and with different teams. So the person that I think had the best experience is someone who has been securely employed at the university for a number of years on a fixed term contract, and their lived experience is very much centred in their work, but also seen as critical and vital to the research that's been undertaken. And they feel like a core team member, not the lived experience person on the side. And Felicity said they were always very insistent that I was a core researcher. I got a lot of reassurance from them, which was really lovely. And even though they had a terrific experience, they still talked about sort of the emotional kind of burden of it. And they didn't realise how much they were carrying until there were other lived experience researchers that joined the team. And that's when they realized they felt a huge sense of relief to not always have to be the one lived experience researcher on the team, and that they could step back at times. They could let someone else lead. They didn't have to tell their story at every meeting, that, yeah. So, and that was the good. The bad was there was a few people in this situation actually. So they were precariously employed, going from one project to another. It was very sort of gig economy like. They felt their lived experience was essential, but not always valued. And Cameron gave an example of where they wanted to really be involved across the whole research project, but only had a certain number of hours allocated. So it was kind of very much kind of ring-fenced for certain aspects of it, but had really wanted to be able to kind of both learn skills and be present for all stages of the research project. And he felt that for some research projects, he had to learn to really lower his expectations on what could be achieved, what he could contribute, what he would be allowed to contribute into the project. And the ugly was, I think Jess really epitomised this kind of feeling of exploitation. So underemployed, and also not just underemployed, but underutilized. So doing very kind of sort of routine tasks that other research assistants without lived experience could have done. They didn't feel that their lived experience was valued, and they felt very exploited. And Jess says that's the frustration, realising I'm only part of the project to get grant funding. Okay. Okay, so this is, as I said, I used a social ecological model for lived experience research. So the discussion is sort of structured across the different levels. So at an interpersonal level, so lived experience researchers are motivated to create change, but their lived experience must be appropriately utilised. There's a really great paper by Tynan and Bishop. They're Indigenous academics, and they talk about the trickery of opportunity, which when exploitation is disguised as opportunities, and I think that's really powerful. The lived experience researchers talked a lot about imposter syndrome. So I think that goes to building their confidence and skills really early. And they were usually on short-term, part-time contracts with little opportunity to acquire a qualification, which is a little bit ironic given we're a university. In terms of the interpersonal level, so academics really played a very pivotal role in the lived experience researchers' well-being and their satisfaction with the work that they were doing. They need to have the skills to do this kind of participatory research and inclusive research well. And if they don't, then they should admit that they need to develop those skills or bring people onto the team that that do have those skills and expertise. Inadequate, inaccessible systems also place a huge burden on academics, and they quite often act as sort of shock absorbers or buffers. So in between, these systems, the inflexible systems, and the lived experience researchers. So they quite often take on the brunt of it, where they're trying to make things run as smoothly as possible for the lived experience researchers. Quite often they kind of disguise or cloak any of the kind of emotional and invisible labor they're doing. So it's not an easy thing to be an academic doing this kind of work in an institution like this right now, or in the past as well, because I think things are getting better. And it can take a toll. So this increasing pressure on academics can then place a downward burden on the lived experience researchers who, where there's deadlines and expectations. So as an institution, the university should adopt an institutional ethic of care towards university-based and lived experience researchers. I think they really need to value this type of work and recognise the time that's needed to support this type of very engaged research. There are more and more designated lived experience researcher positions, but they're sort of still very invisible across the university. I'm part of a research team doing a project just in the medical, dentistry and health sciences faculty. It's huge faculty because we're just trying to work out who is there at the moment. And there needs to be some thought and consideration around training and development opportunities and career progression for lived experience researchers. And funders. So they must go beyond supporting tick box inclusion and they should require evidence of expertise and a track record in lived experience research from teams who are submitting to them. They should ensure project plans and budgets, evidence that resources are in place for lived experience researchers, and they need to be much more flexible about timelines. Okay, sorry, I'm racing now because I want to leave some time for questions. I might skip this one. So just some final thoughts. Lived experience research to be done well and equitably and in an empowering way, it requires time. And I don't think all research needs to include people with lived experience. And I love this this quote from Lynette, and I love Carolyn Lynette's work. So if you have a chance to read her work, but she says it's not magical just because it's participatory. It doesn't. Not all research projects need to be participatory. And I also love this. This is the trampoline analogy. But when it's appropriate and it's done right. Yeah, it can still be really, really messy. But there's joys and risks of balancing together on a trampoline. And I think, if you don't try to balance together, or if there's no intention to balance together, then that's when things can and no recognition that balancing needs to happen in the first place. I think that's when things can go a bit pear-shaped. And, I'll stop where I started, that this really, we really need to honour the radical roots of this kind of way of working, and resist it becoming co-opted or by neoliberal agendas of the university and others. So I'd just like to acknowledge Professor Karen Block and Kathy Vaughan. Thank you for your supervision and your friendship as well, and just being co-conspirators over the years. The participants who spoke to me, and also my amazing colleagues at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. I will just give a bit of a plug for the Social Equity Institute's Community Engaged Research Network. We meet pretty frequently through the year, 3 or 4 times. We have a really lovely get together. We hear from other people doing research in this way, and then we have drinks and nibbles, and it's very nice. It's very social. And then also the community engaged and co-productive research repository, this is evidence of my nerdiness. So this is just a repository that we put together of participatory research papers. It's been fairly rigorously put together. There's quite a high criteria to be featured in this. So we've done a lot of hard work in categorizing research under different methods or different disciplines with different populations. So please go and check it out. And if there's a paper that you love that you think should be in there, please let me know. And isn't there, let me know and we can easily add it in. These are my references. There we go. Okay.